Mm-mm. Yeah, yeah. Good to see you all. Remember, we have a quiz this week, quiz number 4. Be aware of it on Friday. It'll be up on Friday, so take notes, do the readings, please. They'll be on there, some of them. Alrighty. Still in Christianity, yes? Playing a video here from the cathedral in Moscow of the Russian Orthodox Church. I guess this was last Christmas with Patriarch, Cyril or Kirill, I think is it Kirill the First or Kirill the Second? I forget which, if he's first or second. Anyways, so he's there. He's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The true church. There he is. Whoops, there he is. Celebrating Christmas. There we go. Get our PowerPoint going. Christianity. Where did I stop? I was on Protestantism. Yes, the Reformation. Protestant Reformation with this dude. Okay, I finished with Sola Scriptura, right, Ms. Winko? Yes? Which means, Ms. Winko? Sola Scriptura, what does it mean? Okay. Does anyone remember what it means? Not you, sir. You make me look bad. You look like you're learning in this class, which is not good, sir. You know, it's making me look really bad. And you. Miss Francis, what do you think? By scripture alone, yeah. Scripture alone. This gentleman, which this actually is probably is a pretty accurate portrait of what Martin Luther looked like. Okay. We also have a death mask of Luther, so we know it's pretty much exactly what he looked like. When he was, people used to do that. When people died, they would put like paste or not paste, but I don't know what it's called. What you call it? Not like paper mache, but you know the stuff that when orthodontists are checking your mouth out for braces, they put that kind of gooey stuff into your mouth to get an impression of your teeth. We would do that, and they would impress it on people's faces so that they could preserve their face. Anyways, the Pope at the time of this man Luther, Martin Luther, was a man, who was called Pope Leo X. Pope Leo X, and you can see when he ruled or reigned as Pope, about 1513 to 1521. And that's a portrait of him. Might be accurate. I don't know why it wouldn't be. It seems to be a contemporary portrait. These are two of his relatives, maybe his nephews, I think, who be made cardinals. That could be the nephew of the Pope, right? Yeah, you get a nice job with an income given to you. Whether they were religiously oriented men, I don't know, but they were certainly cardinals. Anyways, and Leo was probably not the kind of Pope you wanted around this time to deal with this particular problem. It's kind of like the wrong man in the wrong place. He wasn't a bad Pope, he wasn't a bad man, but he was not a reforming Pope. You know, he was a playboy. You know, he liked to hunt and have parties and lived a good life as the Pope. So, he wasn't like an evil person. You know, he wasn't a saint either. And but he was kind of emblematic for Luther of all the problems with the church. And he certainly got the controversy started because it was him. He needed money. Okay, the Vatican needed money because you had the church to take care of it. They had the papal states, Vatican City, which was, the whole central portion of Italy was its own country ruled by the popes. So, they needed money and they needed revenue. And so the church was always looking for ways to get revenue. And, the business of the church was spiritual stuff. So you sell what you got, right? You know what I'm saying? So the church, the Pope wanted to renovate St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, this large church, and that, of course, cost money for the construction and the renovation. So he came up with, this idea of preaching. It's called an indulgence. I don't think it's mentioned in the textbook, but I'll write it just because I'm using the word. But anyways, it was this idea that, by doing certain, the church is kind of the custodian of grace, of God's grace. God is kind of like, the church is kind of like a bank, a repository of God's grace. And the church kind of mediates God's love and help to humanity. So there she is. And so the church can distribute God's grace. Of course, you have access to God with God's grace. God loves me as a Christian anyways. But the church kind of distributes God's grace to people. Is that mirrored? I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my recorder here and it's mirroring. It's putting things backwards rather than they should be, which it doesn't usually do. Oh, you know why? Because I'm still using that, but it should be, that's why. Okay. Hold on one second. Let me come back. Let me stop my recorder for a second. There we go. Okay, so I just had to end task. All right. Sorry about that delay. Okay, so an indulgence. So they call this an indulgence of the church. Okay, through the church you can receive God's grace by doing certain good works or whatever. Okay, which is fine. You don't have to pay for that. But Leo, in order to raise money, kind of attached, not a payment, but a free will offering, Ms. Vesey. A free will offering. So you could get these slips from, we send out preachers throughout Europe, preaching this indulgence for St. Peter's, the St. Peter's indulgence, that, if you gave a free will offering, few gold coins or silver coins or something, then you could get an indulgence and you could apply it to dead members of your family. So, they would benefit from God's grace by, having their sufferings in purgatory, in the afterlife be minimized so that they can get into heaven quicker or more quickly and stuff like that. That's the basic. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Do you have an idea basically of what's going on here? Okay. Typically, you should not pay money for spiritual things. That's actually a crime according to church law, even back then. But you weren't paying for these spiritual benefits. It was a free will offering, okay? And they could be given freely to people who needed them. But, the message kind of got mangled in the process. And so these preachers who were going throughout Europe preaching on behalf of the Pope for this indulgence, a lot of times they were just making it very clear, you pay me or you don't get the indulgence, which they shouldn't have been doing. Or they were making false promises that if you bought the indulgence, you gave me the money and you wanted to apply the benefits of the indulgence to, say, a loved one who had died. The moment that your money, one guy had a little rhyme, a little jingle, when the money in the box rings, the soul of your relative from purgatory springs. Jumps out of purgatory and goes right into heaven. If you give me money, money, money. All right? And there were other problems. For example, the bishops, again, the church was in disarray. So one of the bishops in Luther's neck of the woods, do I have it written down here? Maybe I wrote it down. Let me see if I wrote it down. I guess I didn't. A bishop should be the overseer of one diocese, right? That makes sense, like the CEO of a company. You don't want to have 3 or 4 CEOs because, like the old saying goes, too many cooks spoil the broth, But, the bishops could tax the faithful, okay, to collect money. So again, money. So that wasn't enough for some bishops. So they asked for permission to have 2 dioceses that they were bishop of, so they would get more money, and that technically was forbidden They shouldn't have been doing that. But the popes would, they'd appeal to the pope, who had the authority, and the pope would give permission, So now this guy was bishop of two dioceses. Well, you can't be in two places at once. So you had dioceses sometimes that had a bishop only in name only. So people were kind of like at a loss for, they didn't have, where's the authority? We never see the bishop. I literally never see him because he's over there in his other diocese, but he's still taking our money. And this bishop in Luther's neck of the woods wanted a third diocese. Now that was wrong. That was definitely against church law. But, the Pope needed his support. He needed to preach the indulgence so the Pope would get money. So in exchange, sometimes, you have to cut deals, right, Mr. Belfield? So in exchange for letting the preachers preach the indulgence in his dioceses, Ms. Oler, now, plural, the Pope's like, all right, take the third diocese, yeah, and collect the money and the taxes from the diocese. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Well, this outraged Luther, okay, and he saw the root of the problem as this practice of indulgences. So he wanted to set up a debate. As a theologian, as a doctor, he wanted to set up a debate on the issue. He was still Catholic. He wasn't questioning Catholic belief or teaching, not yet. But it opens the can of worms because it becomes an issue of more than just the indulgences. Like, what about this? But what about this? What about the other? Other issues come out. All right. Gonna draw it through. Does that sound better? A little bit better? All right. So what happens, and initially, Pope Leo hears about this German monk, friar, who's causing trouble up in Germany about the indulgences, and Pope Leo doesn't think it's any big deal. He just excommunicates. He's like, what do according to the story, could be a legend, but apparently, Pope Leo was like, why should I be concerned about some drunken German monk? That was his attitude. And also, according to the legend, he apparently, signed the bull of excommunicating Luther while he was on a hunting trip. He was like, Paul, oh yeah, Pope, Papa, Leo, Tres Decimus. Anyway, Pope Leo, 10th, Decimus. Pope Leo the 10th. So he really did not understand the depth of the problem that Luther was exposing, or at this time, the depth of the hatred of the church that people had, because they've been promised reform so many times before over the centuries and nothing had been done. So eventually, you have this break off. The Protestants, the one who are protesting against the abuses they see in the church, which starts with this idea of indulgences, but it extends to other issues, theological issues in the Christian church, or Christianity. Hopefully you've read this. I gave you some excerpts from this, the Augsburg Confession, which was, the Protestants' attempt to kind of state out in a systematic way what they believed and what problems they had with the church as it was in their time. So maybe you took a look at that or listened or read that. I only give you excerpts from it. But, there were a lot of points of agreement, but there also, if you read it, you'll see there are points of a lot of disagreement. And a lot of the disagreement was not about things that were really of the faith. It was stuff like, whether priests could get married, fasting, avoiding certain foods and certain days, and like not eating meat on Fridays or stuff like that. Vows, religious vows. Remember, Luther was a friar, so that was close to his heart. And a lot of the early Protestants were former monks and priests. And so they were big on, the vows that they had to take as priests. So that was their concern. Those probably could have been hammered out. But anyways, they weren't. So the Augsburg Confession, the name for this common statement of faith, which summarized the basic beliefs of the reformers. Okay. And a lot of them were in line with Catholic belief, but there are also some differences that were clearly emerging. Now, Anglicanism, or the Church of England, what happens in England is different from the Protestant Reformation. Eventually, the Church of England and the Protestant Reformation on the continent will come together in a marriage, no pun intended, as you'll find out. But at the moment, the formation of the Church of England is quite different. Okay, we have this guy, Henry VIII. There's a picture of him, probably accurate, who reigned as the King of England from 1509 to 1547. And he was married, but he wanted a divorce. He wanted to marry another woman. Okay, he was married to this woman, a Spanish woman, Catherine of Aragon. Okay, Aragon is a kingdom in Spain. Okay, they're both Catholics. Catholic marriage. But Catherine was not giving him male heirs. He needed a male to succeed. Henry VIII's big focus was on getting a male child who could succeed him to the kingship. Okay, and Catherine was not supplied. Now, she was having children, but either they were female or if they were male, they died soon after. Oh, what's that, Miss Short? Cheetos? What was Cheetos? Ooh, party mix. Right, party, yes. Anyways, so she wasn't producing what he wanted. They said if she had boys, they died soon after. So he was getting desperate. And so he had mistresses. He was sleeping around on her also. And they seemed to be, one of his mistresses, whom he loved, appeared to be fertile. And he decided, appeared to be fertile. This lady, Anne Boleyn. I believe her name was Anne Boleyn. Yes, there it is. I think it's with an E. Anyways, he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn so he could have male heirs and continue his family line. And so he asked for permission from the Pope at the time. It was Pope Clement VII at this time. This is before Luther. The Pope before Pope Leo X. And the Pope said no, the current marriage was valid. It was there were no problems with the marriage. They both knew what they were getting into. They had no problem. It was only afterwards when Henry was not satisfied with the kind of kids she was producing that all of a sudden he said there were problems with the marriage and that it should be dissolved. Pope said, sorry, can't do it. I don't have that power. It's a valid marriage. And Henry's like, well, I'll do it anyways. So he decides that he's going to take over the church in England as the head of the church. And then he got the bishops of the English church to give him the permission to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope Clement VII responds by excommunicating Henry. And Henry responds by saying, no, doesn't matter anyways. I'm the supreme head of the English church. It is now the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Anglia is Latin for England. It's a Latin word for England. Anglia. The Angli. It's the name of the Germanic tribe one of the Germanic tribes that settled in England, the Angli. So it's called Anglicanism, the English experience of the Reformation, for a completely different reason. It wasn't really, there was some theology involved, obviously, the idea of divorce and what is marriage and is a marriage valid or not. But it was also very political. It's the who controls the church, and I want a divorce, I can't get one, so I'll just basically take away the church from the papal authority. I'll be now the authority. I'll be the head of the church. So it's the Church of England. So Henry was a Catholic in belief. Belief-wise, that never changed. But later on, over the decades, the Anglican community would start to ally itself with the larger Protestant Reformation that was going on the European continent, and would become much more Protestant. And basically, in theology, the Anglican Church is Protestant in its belief system, but, it kind of sees its way as kind of a halfway house. There's still a lot of, they like the ritual of Catholicism. So if you ever go to an Episcopalian, who are the Anglicans in America, or you go to an Anglican church, you can find a lot of ritual and pomp and circumstance, even more so than Catholic churches in some cases. But the preaching will be very Protestant. It will be still sola, you're saved by faith alone, by God's grace alone. Scripture is the ultimate authority. They do retain the traditional authority structure of bishops, priests, and deacons, which other Protestants got rid of. So they see themselves as kind of cutting the child in half, in a matter of speaking. They keep those parts. Some parts of their Catholic heritage, but also a number of things that have been imported from Protestantism. Okay, so Protestantism, all right, which I guess I don't need to tell you. Anyways, the response of the Catholic Church was the Council of Trent, which was a Reformed council. You can see the dates when it met, 1545 to 63. It's like 20-some years. It met in northern Italy. And finally resolved, it really was finally the Reformed Council that the Catholic Church needed in the Western Church. But for Protestantism, it was too little too late. They were already gone, doing their own thing. And it did reform the Catholic Church, but it did nothing to resolve the separation. So you still have the Protestant communities to this day. Okay. So here's a map of what it looked like at the time. We've got the areas in yellow are majority Catholic, okay, where Wittenberg, remember Luther was at Wittenberg, so, a lot of northern Germany, Scandinavia came over to his position, Lutheranism. A lot of areas of Germany, especially southern Germany, remain Catholic in their religion. But then you have places like in the Alps and the mountains of Switzerland, you have other Protestants, because you had the extremes of Protestants. You had Lutherans, the original Protestants, I guess you could say. All right? But then you had the Reformed groups, which were, united around another man named Calvin. And a lot of his influence was here in Switzerland and up in Scotland. This is in the textbook, this man Calvin, who I think was a lawyer. Luther was a friar and a priest. Calvin was a lawyer. But you had another man, a priest. They have it on here, the Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism. Well, anyways. And so, you had Luther, Calvin were the two big ones, two influential groups. And actually, Protestantism today in theology is more Calvinistic than it is Lutheran in most Protestant denominations. So even though he was not the beginner of the Reformation, Luther was, this man John Calvin actually was in a way more influential, much more influential than Luther ever was in theology. Of course, you have the Anglicans here with England. They're just here in merry old England. It's the Church of England, so there you go. And of course, you have Eastern Orthodox Christians over here. The Protestant Reformation didn't really affect them very much because it started in the Western Church. It will later. That's why I asked you to read the Confession of Dositheus, because that was because there were fears that the leader of the Orthodox churches, or one of the leaders, had become a Calvinist, to become a Protestant in his belief system. So they had to react against that. But there was really not much of an influx of Protestantism into the Eastern Orthodox community. It mainly affected and split up the West. Okay, the next big event, and I'm going to mention this, the Enlightenment. I think I'd skip over it, but I want to mention it because we did mention it with Judaism, and it affects Christianity as well. This is another thing that happens in Western Europe. We call it in history, it's called the Enlightenment or the Age of Light, the enlightening. The Jews call it the Haskalah, yes? Remember Haskalah? Okay. And it affected them, but it also affected the European Christians as well. Starts in England around the 1600s and spreads to France and other places on the continent. It's dated to around the 1800s. The end of the Enlightenment is the 1800s. I think during the French Revolution, when they started chopping off everybody's head they could find, I think people were like, we're not in the age of reason anymore, Mr. Whitehawk. We're in the reign of terror. That is what it is. If you can, sir. If you can. Okay. And the Enlightenment, just like in Judaism, is carny. The Enlightenment affected how Jewish people were interpreting their practice of of Judaism. And so you had more liberal and a desire to embrace the Enlightenment and rationalism and to purify the Jewish religion of, say, superstitious beliefs or what they thought were irrational beliefs. The same thing happens with Christianity. So you have this break between more liberal, progressive forms of Christianity and Catholicism in the West. In Protestantism, it was called simply liberalism. In Catholicism, they called it modernism. The modern age, right there it is, modernism. But basically the same thing, trying to apply the insights of the Enlightenment to the Christian faith. Right? We did this definition for modernism. I probably won't ask you about this definition, just so you know that they're just two sides of the same coin. When Protestants were struggling with the Enlightenment, okay, and they wanted to jettison ideas in Christianity that they thought were irrational, like the idea of miracles, like a virgin birth, that Mary didn't have sex to conceive Jesus, or that Jesus rose from the dead, because dead bodies don't do that, So we get rid of those things, but we reinterpret them. So maybe the resurrection of Jesus might be, by liberal Christians, might be reinterpreted as like maybe a spiritual event. Jesus is taken up into heaven with God, or I don't know, something like that. Whereas then you had the reaction against this, just like you had the reaction in Judaism. You had Reform Judaism, but then you had the reactions, conservative and Orthodox. You also had a reaction in Christianity, fundamentalism. It's called fundamentalism, which comes from a series of books that were written by, I guess you could say, conservative Christians, but in response to the Enlightenment, affirming, the spiritual and supernatural beliefs of Christianity. So that's where the series, it was a series of books, volume 1. So it wasn't just one book, okay? And the series was called The Fundamentals. So they're affirming the fundamentals of Christian belief, like the virgin birth of Jesus, or the resurrection, that he actually did bodily rise from the dead. All these things that the liberal versions of Christianity were denying. So it comes to be called fundamentalism, those who were affirming the fundamental. The Catholic Church finally got around to addressing the Enlightenment only in the 1960s at a council that was held in Rome in Vatican City, at St. Peter's Basilica. There's a picture of the bishops. Okay, so from 1962 to 65. I'm not going to go deep into it because it's not necessary. Well, we talked about the Second Vatican Council at the beginning of the class when we read Nostra Aetate and Ad Gentes, some of what it has in the Catholic Church view other religions. So you already know about it. But yeah, this was kind of a reform council, but it was also a response finally to the Enlightenment. Some might say better late than never. But anyways, this was the 1960s, yes? So 1965, they didn't know about the summer of 68 and 69 and what was coming and the sexual revolution, all these revolutions that happened at the end of the 60s and into the early 70s. They didn't know that. They weren't prophets in that sense. They didn't know the future. And so you can see statistically the decline of the Catholic Church, people not going to church anymore, people not believing in Catholic beliefs anymore. So really, some might say that modernism was there in the Catholic Church, unrecognized, And in a way, maybe has kind of triumphed in the Catholic Church, although it still tries to kind of preserve its traditional beliefs. Nevertheless, that was the response, or attempt at a response to modernism. History will tell how good of a response it has been. Okay. The deposit of faith. This is the name for the body of teaching and practices related to Jesus that has been derived from his followers, the apostles, and the early Christian community. Okay, so it's a deposit. Again, it's like with indulgences. The church is like a bank, and you draw on your deposit. The deposit here is not money, it's beliefs. The things that Christians believe that have been handed on, passed on about this man Jesus. It's your heritage, you might say, the Christian heritage. So everything that the apostles learned about Jesus of Nazareth and passed on about him in their own preaching, talking about him, telling stories about him, but also in their manner of life, the way they lived, the teachings of this man Jesus. And that's in Jesus, really the example of Jesus and his teachings are where Christianity draws its beliefs. However, as we find in other religions, this deposit of belief, it's like we see with the Torah, or in Judaism, but we also see with Hinduism in the Smriti literature and the Shruti, see a similar development in this religion, that this deposit of faith comes in two forms, a written form, and I'll pass over this, don't worry about it, a written form and a oral form, a spoken form. The written form is called sacred scripture. Scriptura, as we know, is simply a writing, okay? A sacred writing, but really scriptura just simply means a writing. And for Christianity, that is what's called the Bible. The Bible. There's your definition. Okay, the group of sacred writings accepted by Christians, the Bible. So we know the Jews don't call it the Bible. What do the Jews call it, Ms. Rojas? What do the Jews call the Bible? What's their word for it? Huh? You don't remember? Okay, that's fine. Does anyone remember what the Jews call it? What do the Jews call the Bible? Ms. Rayner, do you remember? Yeah, they're writings that Christians would call the Bible, but Jews don't call it that. Torah, that's a part of it. You're on the right track, miss. I got you, Ms. Boritz. Go ahead. The Tanakh, yeah. Torah, right, Ms. Rayner? And then the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then the writings, the Ketuvim, so the Tanakh, which is part of the Christian Bible, okay? They add their stories about Jesus, right? Okay. This, I should correct this. Actually, the word Bible comes from Greek plural. This is the singular. It should be ta biblia, which means the books, actually. That's where the word Bible comes from. The books is what it literally means in English. And it's the name for the complete collection of Christian sacred writings. Writings. So it's a library of writings. It's multiple books. It's not just one singular book. Okay? It's the Bibles, you might say. But the origin of the term is plural, the books, ta biblia. What books should be in this Bible? We'll get to that in a second. What books should be in this Bible was not officially established, at least in Western Christianity, until around the 1400s. The year 1442 sticks in my mind for some reason. But anyways, in the 1400s, there was a church meeting in Florence of Italy, the Council of Florence, in the 1400s. And that was the first time that, at least in the Western church, they gave an official list of which books absolutely needed to be included in a Christian Bible. Until then, it was basically traditional. I mean, they had lists and an understanding, but this is the official thing, because there have been questions raised. Okay, until there were questions raised, they didn't really deal with it. So that's when that happened. The canon has still not officially been determined in Eastern Orthodoxy, the Eastern churches. Remember, after the schism between East and West, they just go on based on tradition, what has been handed down and told to us. It wasn't until Dositheus that I mentioned before, the Confession of Dositheus, which was from a council in Jerusalem, actually Bethlehem, but near Jerusalem. I think it was 1642, the 1600s. He does treat in one point which books should be in the Bible. Whether that's an official list is still a matter of debate. Okay, so maybe you could say in Eastern Orthodoxy that not until the 1600s, possibly, with the Confession of Dositheus, but definitely with Roman Catholics, the Council of Florence, and also reaffirmed by Trent. Protestants? Well, who knows? I mean, Protestants are each in their own separate group, so each group has to decide, and most Protestants have an idea what should be in their Bibles, but there are other groups that identify as, they're not Protestant, but as Christian, that add stuff, like the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons that we talked about, who not just have the Bible, but they add on the Book of Mormon. They have another book called the Doctrine and Covenants, another book called the Pearl of Great Price, et cetera, and so forth. So they add on continuing revelation. So when you get to Protestantism, Mormons would not call themselves Protestants, I know, but just for simplicity's sake, when you get to other groups like that, you don't always know. Generally, they do have an idea, but there's no Protestant council, no Pope of Protestantism to kind of say this is what's definitively there. So it's never been technically decided, I think, amongst the Protestants. Okay. The Bible, the authors of the books of this book called the Bible are largely unknown. We have some names, but names are names, and some of them are very common names, and they don't necessarily identify themselves, so we don't know. And it's believed by Christians, generally by Christians, not all Christians will believe this, but say the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, a lot of the more conservative Protestant churches would say that the Bible is inspired, it's been spiritually motivated to have been written by God. It's an inspired writing. It's been God-breathed. It's been motivated. The people who wrote these books were motivated to write by God himself. And the Bible, as a library, actually contains two libraries and two canons, or two official lists, or two official sets of literature. The first part is the Tanakh, which Christianity received from Judaism, because, as we know, Christianity comes out of first century Judaism and then diverges from rabbinical Judaism. And then specifically Christian writings, or you could say Jewish Christian writings, that are added on to the Tanakh, which is called the New Testament. So the Tanakh starts to be called the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant. Testamentum in Latin means a covenant, a berit, which we know from Judaism. So or you could also say the former. Lost it. She'll come back, I hope. You think she'll come back, Miss Francis? Think so? Yeah, I think so. I hope so. There's so many people sitting in the back. Got all these empty chairs up front. That makes me feel bad. It's like, no, it doesn't. It's okay. Anyways, the former covenant, okay, with the Jews, and so that's the name given by Christians. Jews it's not former to them. It's still a living covenant for them. But Christians call it that, their version of the Jewish scriptures. And then the Christian writings that were added about Jesus. Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the former covenant So we have the new covenant, the current covenant in Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah and Christ of Israel. Added on. That's why the New Testament comes last. It doesn't come first. Christians don't place the story of Jesus first in their writings, although he's the most important character. They add it on. It's added on to the end of the Old Testament. Okay. Do I want to mention that or maybe move on? The Old Testament is divided into 4 sections. So it's still the Tanakh, but Christians have different divisions for the books of the Tanakh. And they categorize certain books differently than the Jews do. Okay? Yeah. I'll get to the New Testament in a second. What am I talking about? I didn't put it in my notes. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. All right. Go by the PowerPoint. The first section is the law of Moses. Okay, this man Moses we talked about with Judaism received a law from God. Okay, and that is contained in the first 5 books. Talked about this already with the Torah, right? The Tanakh. Which are generally called the Pentateuch, or the 5 volumes. A tukos means a hinge. So anything with a hinge. So like a volume, a book with a hinge. So the 5 volumes, which we already know what these are from Torah, yes? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Same books. So this portion is no different, just the name is different, the Pentateuch, as it's commonly called, or the Law of Moses. Then that's followed by a section of books called the historical books, books that are generally considered histories. They're telling the history or the story of what happened to the Jews, especially when they had their kingdoms and stuff like that. So that's what the history books, various histories. Then the third section are wisdom books, wisdom literature, and wisdom is specialized and profound knowledge of, specialized and profound knowledge of ethical and practical pursuit of human flourishing. Okay, so that's what wisdom literature is about. Nothing Christian or Jewish or religious about wisdom literature. You find it throughout all human cultures. People write stuff about how to live. They're kind of like self-help books. That you go to the bookstore. You don't go to any bookstore, I know. But, you go on Amazon, you look for self-help books. Those are our modern equivalent of what scholars would call wisdom literature in the ancient world. All right? They're telling you how to be ethical, how to act in life in order to be successful, to flourish as a human being. Okay? Well, the Jews had their own type of wisdom books as well, and those are collected in this section. Okay? Wisdom means to know, to have knowledge of things. Okay? Old English witan, to know. And then finally, the prophets. So we see that, we have 2 of the sections of the Tanakh. We've got the Torah and the Pentateuch, and then we have the prophetical books here. Okay? And then the Ketuvim are divided up between the historical books and the wisdom books. And the prophets are basically the same as you'll find in the Jewish Tanakh. Okay? There are some differences. We talked about what a prophet was. But for example, just to give you one difference, Christians usually consider this man Daniel, the book of Daniel, to be prophetic, and so they place it within the prophetic books, the book of Daniel. Whereas if we look at the Tanakh of the Jews, Daniel is placed just simply in the writings. He's not placed in the Nevi'im and the prophets. The book of Daniel is seen more as a story, not a prophetic figure. So he's put in the Ketuvim. Christians interpret Daniel differently as a prophetic. And in the Christian Bible, for the more ancient Christian communities like the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, not the Protestants, we'll talk about that in a moment, their Old Testaments are actually longer, have more books than the current Jewish Tanakh or Bible. Why is that? Well, that's just because in the first century, from what we know, first century Jews actually had a longer canon, a longer bunch of books that they read and accepted as sacred writings than would later be decided within rabbinical Judaism. Okay, so again, you see that divergence, you see that ancient custom still in Christianity, in the ancient Christian churches that come from the first century. Okay, because the Christian Old Testament, which they took from the Jews, was longer. It had more books, additional books that were considered scripture. Books like, just to mention one or two, the book of Tobit. This man Tobit. He's placed in historical books. But you also have other books that the Jews had as well that are just longer. They have additions to them, like this book Esther about this Jewish woman. In Hebrew, it's a shorter book. But the Christians follow a Greek translation of it made by some Jew, I don't know who. That just rhymed because it does, Mr. Vital. You know, sometimes the poetry just comes out and I can't control it, you know. Anyways, who added all sorts of details to the Hebrew text. Well, it's that longer Greek text that the Christian churches accepted, okay? The Jews later on just accepted the Hebrew text, which is shorter. So you have some books that are completely new, like Tobit, that are added, but other books that are shared with the Jews, like Esther. Also, the book of Daniel is longer in the Christian Bible, stuff like that. So you have some differences from first century Judaism. The Jews would later decide on their books, and they would, for various reasons, we don't know exactly the reason, but there are various theories about how they went about it, but eventually they would just have only a certain set, and so there were a variety of books that were just later not accepted. Where does Protestant Christianity come into this? Because remember, sola scriptura, yes, was one of the battle cries of Luther. And you can't trust the popes and bishops because, or any men or women, because they're all depraved and corrupt and sinful. So we go to the Word of God because then we know that comes directly from God. And who should know what the Word of God is in the Old Testament? The Jews. The Jews. The Jews should know what should be in the Old Testament, right? Because that was the logic, you know? And so Luther decided, no, we don't accept all these books, Tobit and the longer Esther. No. We'll only accept what the Jews have in their Bible. Because he assumed that historically, he made an historical assumption, which was wrong actually, but he didn't know the history. Almost nobody did in the 1500s. That actually the Jews had preserved the canon faithfully, and that it was the shorter version. Once historical studies in the modern period and other biblical manuscripts were discovered, we're like, oh, wait a second, we now know what the situation was in first century Judaism, and there were a lot of Jews who had a longer list of books, and that just came into early Christianity, and Luther was wrong. But that's why the Protestants have a shorter version of the Old Testament, or at least let's say the Jewish version of the Old Testament. Not the longer Christian version, a smaller version. Okay, the New Testament is added on to the Old Testament. So that's the name, as I told you, that the Christians give. It's added to the Old Testament, but it's not a supplement, okay? It's not an add-on, but it's added to. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the Tanakh is now seen and is reread in the light of Jesus of Nazareth, who Christians believe fulfilled God's revelation to Israel. And in the New Testament, we also have 4 divisions. It just works out that way, Ms. Winko. It's, I don't think it's deliberate. But we have 4 divisions. First, we have the stories of Jesus, which are called the Gospels. Stories about Jesus. Then we have, I put that there. I should have reversed it. Oh, well. Go to letters. Okay. Then we have a bunch of letters, the genre of letters written by different people to other people or communities. We have one book which is an historical book, portrays itself as a history of the early church, early Christian community. And one book that's called apocalyptic literature, apocalypse. and apocalypse. What are these things? Well, first of all, we'll come back to that. Oh, no, because I do this. No, I don't do that. PowerPoint. We have 4 Gospels. Oh, I didn't put this on the PowerPoint. Let me see if hold on a second here. Oh, I guess I didn't. It's an oversight. Well, whatever. I can write it on the board. We have 4 Gospels about Jesus. There were many more writings about Jesus from early Christianity that we know about, but 4 were determined to be the most authentic, the ones that were accepted by the church as, portraying Jesus most accurately. They're attributed to 4 individuals: Matthew, first Mark, Luke, and John. Right? These are just names. We have no idea who these people were. They're just, some of them are very common names, like John is a very common Jewish name. Mark also is a very common Gentile name, non-Jewish name. Marcos. But we don't know. They don't identify who they are. Their names are attached to these 4 different writings. So we don't know. We have some historical details later on. So we might know something about them, but basically most scholars think that we don't know. So we just have names. Anyways, Mark is, even though Mark comes second in this list, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1, 2, 3, 4, Mark is believed by almost all scholars to have been the earliest gospel to have been written. And that Matthew and Luke copied off of Mark. Okay, so you have Mark writing first, and then Matthew and Luke copying off of him, because almost the whole text of Mark appears in each of their Gospels. The whole Gospel of Mark almost. And then they add on additional stories that they have. And then the Gospel of John is completely independent, because whoever wrote John has totally different stories, for the most part, from the other Gospels. Doesn't seem to know of their existence, so the Gospel of John is independent. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related. John is independent. So those are the 4 Gospels. And it's a genre of literature. It's a Christian genre. We don't have anything really called a gospel until Christianity appears. And scholars still debate amongst themselves what is a gospel? Because it's not really a biography, because it doesn't go from Jesus' birth through all the events of his life and then leading up to his ministry and do all these. It's not really a biography of Jesus. It's very selective about the stories it wants to tell about him, and really focuses only on his ministry and pretty much nothing else. But especially the Gospels are meant to tell the story of his suffering, his death, and then his resurrection. All of them agree on that. That's what they want to get to. Yes, God bless you. It's all keeping So we're not sure. There are different. The Gospels don't really fit into any type of ancient literature that we're aware of. Okay, they have similarities to ancient biography, similarities to certain types of literature that people would write about their heroes, where they would kind of tell stories to show their various virtues and stuff like that. He did this, he did that, he did the other, to show, what a great guy this, my teacher was, if I was his student or something. There are resemblances between the Gospels and that, but there are also differences. Okay? So we're not sure, but it's called the Gospel. Good news. The good message. Heu means good. Angelos, an angel, is a messenger. Angelos, a message. So bringing in the good message. Now this word, maybe provides a key for understanding what genre this is, because, Christians didn't make this word up. They took it from, Roman politics. Evangelion, good message or good news, was usually used in announcements of the new reign of an emperor or a king. I bring you good news that our divine emperor is now reigning and doing all these great things. So is that what's going on with the Christians? They're bringing us the good news that their king, the Christ of Israel, their Messiah, has come. And they're going to tell you all the good things that he's done, his miracles, his teachings, but ultimately his death on the cross for the sins of the world and rising from the dead. Maybe that shows us something, what it's supposed to be. I have a whole bunch of letters. Actually, the letters are earlier than the Gospels. Most of the letters, I should say. In dating them, they're earlier than the Gospels. So if you want to kind of like peek into Christianity before the story of Jesus was written down, you can look at some of these letters. Most of them come from our friend Paul of Tarsus, who could be called the father of Christianity. In fact, most of the New Testament is stuff from Paul. Most of the letters, most of the New Testament are letters from Paul. The Gospel of Luke was apparently a follower of Paul. So one of the Gospels is related to Paul. So Paul of Tarsus is all over the place in the New Testament. The history as well. There's one history called the Acts of the Apostles, which was also written by Luke. It's actually part 2 of his Gospel. They were one work, the Gospel and then Acts. They got separated. But again, so we have another connection to Paul. Acts of the Apostles by Luke, his disciple. All right, so Acts of the Apostles, which basically just gives a little, it's a history, it gives a lot of historical details, but basically, and it doesn't talk about all the apostles, it just talks about 2 of them. Peter, Simon Peter, I think I mentioned before, and Paul. Those are the 2 main apostles that Luke is concerned about, and he kind of is giving us a description of the extension of the church out into the world. And then apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, I didn't give you a definition for this, sorry about that. But apocalyptic literature is basically literature that is meant to reveal the other world, the supernatural world. So usually apocalyptic literature is full of visions of heaven or the spiritual world. Visions. It's a revelation. And that's what apocalypse means. Apokalypsis in Greek means revelation, to reveal something. So we have this book called The Revelation of John. I have no idea which John it is. Could be John who wrote the Gospel of John. There's an apostle of Jesus, his name's John. Could be him. Could be somebody completely different. John was a common name. We don't know. But he receives these revelations or visions from God about, like the end of the world and also what's going on in history at the time. Christians are suffering. They're being killed for their faith by the Roman Empire. And so he has a lot of symbolism related to the emperors of Rome and stuff like that. That's what's going on there. It's a revelation of that. And telling Christians basically, keep the faith because Jesus has conquered and he'll come back. So that's apocalyptic. We have apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament as well, but it's not they usually don't qualify it as that. Like I mentioned, the book of Daniel, which is placed in the prophets. The book of Daniel is apocalyptic literature, even though it's placed in the prophets, but they don't usually separate it out. All right. So we have writings, but we also have the lived experience, the stuff that's been passed on by word of mouth, which is called tradition, handed on, stuff handed on. Trado, in Latin, means to hand on, pass on. So it's anything passed on or handed on, customary beliefs or practices, could be traditions, customs, but that's not what Christianity means here. Be careful with it. I know it can be confusing. Christianity is not just talking about customs or habits of doing things, like what kind of language you might use in a worship service or how you might organize it or something like that. Tradition has more weight here. Sacred tradition is a weightier idea. It's the lived experience of the Christian church, of Jesus's teachings and the experience of Jesus. So sacred tradition is not necessarily a bunch of writings like the Talmud, which could be you kind of call the Talmud the Jewish version of sacred tradition. Records all the, oh, you came back, Mr. Prinzia. Records all like the ideas of the rabbis and Rabbi so-and-so and the name of Rabbi so-and-so. They're handing on or passing on the traditions. There's no real written down, although there are writings that come later and would be considered expressive of the church's belief, especially in early times. And it's considered sacred because the subject of its transmission is sacred. Jesus is sacred. He's a supernatural person. So just be aware of that. Sacred tradition is not tradition in the normal, casual way of speaking, like customs or ways of doing things. Okay? Tradition doesn't typically change. You don't modify tradition. It's a representative of what Christians have believed and are supposed to believe about Jesus. And it's believed that a lot of these traditions have been handed on to Christianity by the apostles, the original eyewitnesses from Jesus. So it's authoritative. But it is the lived memory of Jesus. It's not writings like the Bible, but the things that Jesus did and taught, his character, the kind of person he was, the kind of man he was, the church's, Christianity's interpretation of what happened to him and what he means for Christians and for the world. That's where you find sacred tradition coming in. And really what happens is, the relationship between sacred tradition and sacred scripture for Christianity is that really scripture is kind of like the written memory of sacred tradition. It's where the kind of like a picture, you take this like a picture on your phone, it's like a first century picture, kind of crystallization of what Christians at the earliest times thought about Jesus, what stories they were telling about him, how they were living the Christian faith. All right, and there's your definition of it. So I don't need to tell. Where do you find these things? They're basically three places that Christians will look to establish sacred tradition. The highest level are church councils, okay, a meeting of the leaders of the Christian church. That's all that a council is. It's a meeting, a coming together. Cum kalo, to call together, a council. All right, so nothing religious about that, just a calling together. But in the context of Christianity or religions, it's usually a meeting of religious leaders, and they decide matters of teaching or discipline, so what they're supposed to believe or how they're supposed to act. Okay, so that's the highest level if we're looking for sacred tradition. The next highest level you would look at are writings of men called the church fathers. Church fathers, were there church mothers as well? Yes, they were, but they didn't leave us any writings, unfortunately, given the culture of the time. So this is a name for these Christian teachers and writers of the early centuries of Christianity who are kind of like touchstones, I guess is a better word, for Christian belief. Okay, you could kind of trace up should these Christians believe this, or is this a novelty? Well, that's what the church fathers say, and you go back into their writings and, oh yeah, Saint so-and-so mentions this belief, or so-and-so talks about this belief. That might give you some idea that it is found in the tradition in some way and has some basis, or it has no basis. You have to be like, well, the church fathers are totally silent on this idea, so maybe this is a new idea. It could still be a valid idea, a development within Christianity, but you use them as kind of like your yardstick, all right? I think you want to use them as your authorities. Church fathers. Some of them are saints in the Christian religion, considered holy men. Some of them aren't. Some of them were nice guys. Some of them were jerks. They're a group of people. This period of the church fathers usually is dated from the 1st century, okay, the 1st century until roughly the 700s. And the 8th century is when historians just decide to cut it off. I guess you had to decide sometime when to cut it off. I don't know exactly why the 8th century is the 700s are so important, but by the 700s, they said, okay, well, we're cutting it off. No more church fathers. That's it. So this period of basically 700 years in the life of Christianity. And then finally, Christian worship, how Christians pray, how they worship, because that's an indication of what people believe, how they worship. So the liturgy, church liturgy, which comes from two words in Greek, laos,
people, which means people, and ergon, which means a work. So the work of the people, or a public work. And again, this, just like the word evangelion, Christians did not make this up. They took this from the culture. A liturgy was basically any public work, So if you build a bridge for the town, he performed a liturgy, he gave money to fund the building of a bridge, or pave the road or something. It's a liturgy. It's a work for the people, to benefit the people. And so Christians took this over to describe their worship. They're doing a public work by worshiping God, for the community. So liturgy. So how Christians pray. If you find that Christians are praying to Jesus as a God, as if he were a God, that tells you something about how they believe. If they're just talking about Jesus or praying, not even praying to him, but they won't pray to him, they say we won't pray to him at all, well, that tells you something about how they view Jesus. Like maybe he's just a man or something. So you can look to worship practices. That's another thing for looking for tradition. Okay. The Christ. Now there's going to be some overlap here with the Messiah, because we talked about this with Judaism. Okay? But we need to see how it's reinterpreted in Christianity. And the idea of the Christ is a major idea for Christianity, right, Ms. Bessie? Ms. Callahan, you know what I'm saying? It's called Christianity, right? It's you and me, my friend. Jesus is called the Christ, which is another word, as we know, for Messiah. I already told you this at the beginning of when we started talking about Christianity. Christos translates the Aramaic word Mashiach, which, or the Hebrew word Mashiach, anointed one, means the same thing. Okay, the anointed one. Whoops. And we already talked about this idea of an anointed one is present in the Jewish scriptures, and there were some people who were expecting a descendant of David, of King David, to come in the future and to liberate and free the Jews. For Christians, this was Jesus. He was the anointed one. However, as we know from Judaism, when we study Judaism, the conception of the Messiah was diverse. There were different ideas about what the Messiah could be. Even some people didn't believe in a Messiah. Even today, like Reformed Jews, most of them don't believe in the Messiah. Orthodox Jews do. But even at the time of Jesus, not everyone had a conception of an anointed one. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Why do Christians believe that he saved the Jews?
He saved the Jews? They say Jesus saved the Jews, saved the world, including the Jews. Huh? No, I don't think you misheard, but I'm getting there. You're a little bit ahead of me, but I'll get there. How does it, maybe not today, but on Thursday. Because because the Messiah was a savior. That's, I think, it was a general thread. Whether it was a political Messiah or a Messiah who was going to be like a prophet or a spiritual leader, salvation was about, he was bringing God's salvation. God was going to save his people through the Messiah. Because that's kind of like a thread. But the problem with the story of Jesus of Nazareth is that whatever Messiah the Jews believed in, he was a victor, right? He was a conqueror, right? A winner. Right? He's supposed to win? It's karma. Yeah, I mean, God, why would God send him? He's supposed to, defeat the enemies of Israel, whether they're spiritual enemies or physical enemies, who cares? He's supposed to be successful. Jesus successful? Was Jesus of Nazareth successful, Ms. Rayner? You don't know? You think he was? He said, oh, Ms. Rayner. Another gray hair in my beard. Hey, yes. Well, Well, let's see what happens to it. He's betrayed by one of his followers to his enemies. All the rest of his followers run away. They don't want to be seen with him. And he is arrested and then killed. That doesn't sound like a success. I mean, do you think, Mr. Whitehawk, that was Jesus' plan the whole time?
Well, I mean, Christians are still here, and the Romans aren't. So,
Well, the Romans are around for a long, long time.
and on grand time scale, we're only there for 500 years.
By the way, Mr. Whitehawk,
Yeah.
out of the scene of the Romans sitting behind you. Have a Roman sitting behind you. I'm assuming Vital is Italian.
So the Romans are still here, sir. We don't call them Romans. And actually, you know how long it's been since the Roman Empire stopped existing?
Well, which Roman Empire are you?
Oh, the Eastern one.
He's 1400.
1400. Oh, I get, okay, yes, okay, you're right. I got you. I'll see you again on Thursday. God bless you all.
Heck, yeah, go.
Have a good day, sir. It's DePrinzio. Didn't I, when I was doing Judaism, didn't I go over the different types of the Messiah people were expecting? I thought I did. Political, spiritual. All right, thank you. All right, yeah. I want to make sure because I was getting some blank stares and I wasn't sure if I was laying something on people that they hadn't heard before. Okay. Well, good day, sir. Have a good day, miss. See you, ladies. Yeah, Messiah. Political, yes. Yeah, because I went over these, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, yeah. All right.